Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you an enthusiastic, client-focused lawyer? Maurice Blackburn Lawyers are hiring a lawyer, associate or senior associate with experience in personal injuries to join their team in Townsville, Queensland. They offer a safe, supportive and collaborative environment backed by inclusive leaders and progressive policies. You'll manage your own file load with support, and if you're ready to join them on this journey to extend access to justice to more Australians, then you should apply right now. Go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns and the issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on today's episode, we're going to speak to Kate Brennan, who is the director of the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney, and she's got tons of experience in leading Christian organisations and serves on the board of World Vision. And Kate and I are going to have a chat about the relationship between faith-based organisations, people of faith, and politics, in particular the Labor Party. And it's a topic that I've been wanting to talk to Kate about for a while now, but we've just never been able to organise a time to get on the blower and have a bit of a yak. So we did today, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation with Kate. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you use, and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And for all the updates, follow Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Thursday morning in Melbourne and on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining me from Sydney is the director for the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney, and she's got heaps of experience in leading Christian organisations and serves on the board of World Vision. Kate Brennan, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Great to be with you.
Look, I wanted to get you on the show for ages, and I know I do say that sometimes with guests. Maybe it sort of speaks to my poor planning more than anything. But I wanted to get you on at the time around Easter, but then we had an election on, and that kind of consumed everything that was happening at that point in time, because I wanted to talk to you about faith and faith-based organisations and people of faith in politics. And it's a subject matter that I've wanted to sort of broach for a number of years. I first saw you when you spoke at an event that was organised by the Chifley Institute, I think it was, in pre-pandemic times at a conference that was organised in Sydney. And seeing you speak at that event was like, I need to get you on the show. I can't believe it's taken that long. That was like 2019, maybe? It
was 2019, yeah. I think I was 8 months pregnant at the time. So it's memorable for me.
Fantastic. But anyway, good things come to those who wait. So what I wanted to, let's just jump straight into it. I feel like in my own journey as a person who's a person of faith, practicing Catholic, but I'll, if I can borrow the term from Stephen Colbert, I'm a practicing Catholic and I need to keep on practicing because I'm really bad at it. That there are assumptions made about people of faith and their voting intentions and the relationship between particularly the Labor Party and people of faith. And it got me thinking about, does Labor have a problem with religion and vice versa? Does the church or broadly faith-based organisations have a problem with politics? And I want to dive into that. But before we do, something happened to me a couple of years ago when I was working at head office, someone said to me, fairly high ranking in the organisation said, "Oh, they won't vote for us. They're Catholic," and I was like, "What?" Which really, I just almost fell to the floor when I heard that. When I think about my tribe, the Irish Catholic diaspora built the union movement and built the Labor Party. And Anthony Albanese is on the record as saying that he grew up with three faiths: the Rabbitohs, Catholicism, and the Labor Party. And I think a lot of us can subscribe to that. Maybe not the Rabbitohs bit. I would substitute that with the Celtic Football Club. But, we all get the point, right? How do we get to this point that we're having people who... actually, one question you can ask is, how do we get to the point where someone inside the Labor Party can't even recognise their own voting base? But, that's for them to try and work out. How do we get to the point that we are now making assumptions that people of faith aren't Labor people?
I think it's such an important question to ask, and I had a really similar experience as the CEO of an Anglican Women's Foundation in Sydney. I was at an event, and there were many such instances like this, but with someone who was a former very senior coalition minister, and I mentioned I'd been in Canberra as a staffer, and at the time, Labor was in opposition. They said, "Oh, so which minister's office did you work in?" And that was the crux of it, that there was just this assumption that if you're a Christian, and in my case a Protestant, that you would just be a Liberal Party staffer. And this is such a problem. It's not good for any political party. It's definitely not good for the church or any religious group for these types of assumptions to be made. And so I think, some of this comes down to, guess what, something Luke Bretherton in the UK would call co-option of some religions and some denominations in politics, so that there's just, a kind of seamless identity built around them. And then some of it is about mistransmission of history. So I think in the Labor Party, stopping telling ourselves the stories that are actually quite foundational about the ethos of the party, the ethic of the party, the significance of various traditions like Catholic social teaching, for bringing together what would otherwise be a bunch of quite disparate ideas, but make us unique in kind of the parties in the left around the world. And so some of the traditions have been lost, and that disconnection has been furthered as Labor has kind of gotten further away from communities. So these things are interrelated.
And that tradition is interesting, because even if I can extend it, I mean, you just made a reference to some of those traditions within the Christian faith, both, Catholic and Protestant. But even like just doing a quick research before the episode, I was reminded when I was a young campaigner working for Michael Danby in Melbourne Port, old Melbourne Port's now Macnamara. I went to a meeting of the Jewish Labour Bund, which was established in 1928 in Melbourne. A strong Labour Jewish union, and with a youth wing that has done so much to set up Jewish organisations here in Melbourne, that does a lot of community organising, and it is overtly left-wing, it's overtly Jewish, it's overtly Yiddish in its traditions, and I'm sure certainly for newer migrants of the Islamic faith as well, we see connections between those faith traditions and the Labor Party. The Labor Party is an avenue for people to I don't want to say the word assimilate, but it's kind of like finding their Google Maps to get around town, right? It helps them, move into newer networks and circles. It's such a critical role, the role that politics plays. But when did this start to happen? When have we got to a point where we're ignoring this connection that existed between the faith-based traditions and the Labor Party?
Well, when you speak about, that great form of organising in Victoria, it makes us think about there has been such a long tradition of Labor embracing diversity, being okay with plurality. And so I think this problem is fairly recent. And some of it, I think, is because we've run out of space to differentiate ourselves from the coalition. Sometimes we're more alike than we would have wanted. And so we've gotten pushed into a space that is not good for us, not good for the communities that we want to work with. And so I think it is a fairly recent thing. You could point to other trends that kind of go alongside it, like there are a number of people within the Parliamentary Labor Party who had significant, experience within their own family of, parents being Methodist ministers, or, parents being significantly involved in local faith communities. And so what we've seen is those people have also exited Parliament, just they've aged out in various ways. And so there's been a bit of a, I think, abrupt shift. And we're starting to see in this new Parliament people wonderfully with diverse faith connections, but there was a bit of a glitch there, I think, and that was reflected in some missteps in terms of election campaigns in the previous election, just because there's that loss of, you could call it cultural competency, to know how to connect to these communities, and an underappreciation of the fact that there's a significant proportion of the Australian population who identify with a faith, and that's even more the case in particular electorates, places like Western Sydney, and we can name others, and just a significant ongoing group who, even just turn up to church each month. More people in Australia go to church each month than go to all the football codes put together in all the games in the entire football season. That's phenomenal, and it's massively underappreciated.
Is it... I don't want to... I'm conscious here not to get on my whole horse, because I wind up my partner all the time about the secular left, and I don't want to do that. But and I think it's great that from the 60s, 70s onwards, that there was a new injection of people into the Labor Party that I guess we brought a secular tradition into the party, which is good for diversity. But with that, is it that we began to, not in the 70s and 80s, but certainly now what we're seeing is that a lot of the candidates that we're pre-selecting are people that are not from faith-based traditions, or faith isn't an important part of their foundation. And we see that mostly amongst white, middle-class Christians. That's where the numbers have dropped off the most in terms of people who are practicing their faith. Particularly white middle-class elites. And I'm not using that in a pejorative term. So therefore, those are the people that we're pre-selecting, and they're the people who actually don't have any connection with their faith. But you've just mentioned before that now we're bringing in, the Parliament's becoming a lot more diverse looking. Those people have got connections into their faith, whether it be the Islamic faith or Judaism or Christianity or whatever it may be. There are exceptions to the rule. I did want to point out this, and I want to name check someone who actually does listen to the podcast. Like Pauline Richards is a state member in Victoria, in the outer southeastern suburbs, is very connected in with her own personal faith. I don't want to speak on behalf of Pauline, but I know that she does a lot of work with the churches down in her neck of the woods, but not in a transactional way, but in a transformational and an important way. But I feel like she's a rarity. Is that because the people we were pre-selecting just weren't connected to some kind of faith-based organisation?
Yeah, I think both of those things are really important and true. So that there's been that issue in pre-selection, and it has privileged what you could call a kind of cosmopolitan elite who are not representing the full breadth and diversity that you could be in Parliament. And the second thing is that there are many, many people we can think of who do bring important faith into their work, and work very hard, for those who don't themselves have a faith, but work very hard to make the connections with communities. And we could name a number of those, and there's been a really good new effort on that. So I think one of the things that you can consider there to add another dimension is just the further diversification that could happen is needed, because there's been overprivileging of people who have represented kind of the cosmopolitan interests of the party. And so it's connected, the lack of representation is connected, I think, with a kind of loss of tradition that values workers. And that's something that we've seen and has started to be righted again.
There was a great book that came out years ago, around the time of the Bush administration, the second Bush, George W. Bush administration, when Karl Rove and the Republicans were really starting to move into certain Christian groups in the United States. And the book was called Jesus Rode a Donkey, making the argument that there is, let's not forget, there is a connection between the left and in particular Christianity. And obviously on the front cover, it had Jesus Christ sitting on the Democratic ass, the Democratic donkey. And I think that, I mean, have we lost sight of that as well? Are we making assumptions? When I say we, I mean the Labor Party here. Are we making assumptions of faith-based people that they don't align with our Labor values? That when we think about people of faith, we think of social issues that don't align with ours, like on gender, on LGBT rights, on a whole host of things. But I guess the argument of this book was, no, the core foundations of both the centre left and Christianity are there's a moral connection there. Did you want to talk more about that and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And picking that very striking image of Jesus on a donkey speaks to what is central to the Christian tradition of solidarity with people. And so that's one of the issues is with the kind of rise of identity politics, there hasn't been, by Labor, a continued critical engagement with politics of solidarity. And so that has meant that we've kind of broken up various segments of issues and failed to show that for people of faith that they don't need to make a choice ultimately between their God and Labor. And on the side of faith communities, we've seen, ascendant within, say, the Christian churches here in Australia, a real focus on single issues, which is unhelpful too and is unrepresentative of, a biblical tradition that has such a deep, deep wells on issues of justice and connection of that with a picture of God's work in the world. And so it's meant that Christian churches have engaged in quite facile ways, often in public life, and have become incredibly defensive and even started to engage in a way that goes beyond being defensive and starts to become kind of exilic in mindset. The idea that we kind of need to get on the equivalent of an ark and just survive through modern politics, salvaging what we can for the future. So, it's a relationship there, and it's become overly focused on issues that are not representative of either political traditions of Labor or faith traditions, and end up being quite destructive.
It's funny. I often point out to some people that, I can make the argument that the most effective and first community organizer was Jesus Christ himself, in which he had a core leadership team of 12 blokes that went out there and then found their own leadership teams of interdependent teams. And next minute, 3.6 billion people subscribed to the Christian faith. It was quite a successful organizing model. And, maybe some of us can sort of base off of that. And keeping with the organizing model, Morris Glassman obviously is a fairly famous community organizer and academic, who has talked a lot about Blue Labor and about engaging with communities, in particular faith-based communities. What can Labor do in that space, do you think, to start to reach out to some of these faith-based communities and build meaningful, transformational relationships?
I think so much can be done. There are so many great examples from community organising overseas and here in Australia. So thinking of organisations in the US, in the UK, London Citizens, and here Sydney Alliance, that have demonstrated that really powerful things can be done when you bring unexpected actors together. And I think that Labor can approach doing things like this by being willing to be present in communities where there are sometimes challenging other forms of authority, where there's even sacred authority, being curious about people's faith, and doing so in a way that seeks to understand difference and bringing a level of kind of ease to dealing with difference, that it's okay to have incredibly unexpected actors in one room working on things together, and to be a party that brings a sense of imagination of what can be done when you do that. We've seen examples of it working on issues like the living wage in the UK, and we've seen great examples here in Australia. But Labor has a great opportunity if it can not only be the party for all Australians, but work with social infrastructure that enables all Australians, quite diverse actors, including faith communities, to get together around some of these big social challenges, and to be okay that sometimes that process might be a bit messy. But if it is really grounded in community, it can be incredibly generative.
Do you think that there is going deeper into the sort of, does Labor have a problem with religion? Sometimes in some social circles and work circles, I've experienced, and I really don't want to sound like I'm playing the victim here because I'm not, but I've just noticed, pejorative conversations about people of faith. And in my own mind, I've sort of gone, that's a bit bigoted. And I've never called them out. I've just sort of kept to myself. Do you think there's an element of bigotry within parts of the party when we think about faith-based people and the organisations?
When thinking through issues like this, and I think it's a really thoughtful comment of yours, Stephen, just to say you don't want to play the victim here, but when thinking through things like this, I think there's been a greater teacher for me on this than someone like Tim Costello, who, when I've shared stories like this in the past, is quick to remind me of, well, people have also experienced great hurt, often from religion, or feel really dissociated, and in many cases lack the kind of understanding of what it means to start from a position of who we are as people, and have experienced life where they're told they have to be quite functionary. So it's incredibly disorienting for them to have a conversation about religion. So I think that that's where I'd place my focus, is just that there's a lot of relationship building still to be done. And I think as a Christian, I want to be able to approach it in a way, and it's very hard to do, of coming from a posture of wanting to serve in those types of conversations and communities because of the hurt that people have likely experienced to date. And being okay, I think, Jesus definitely experienced a lot of bigotry himself. And so in some ways that stuff isn't new, and that we can serve as even, a minority in society, that having the cultural ascendancy on this stuff is not a requirement. In fact, it's probably a detriment to us. So getting used to serving where there's not going to be understanding, there's not going to be knowledge, there's going to be fractured relationships is something that I think Christians can do well to get used to.
You mentioned authority before, and the Labor Party loves to devolve power to other groups and just open the doors and be far more open and transparent and democratic. And I'm being very, very, very sarcastic there when I say that. Does the Labor Party have a problem with authority and devolving authority to others? And what do we what can we learn from other organisations that have been far more successful at that?
So we talked about how we'd wanted to have this conversation for a while, and I think this last couple of years have been significant in this regard for how we think about the Labor Party and authority. Think back to 2019 when we saw each other at the Chifley conference, and Adrian Pabst had just come out from the UK and written a book on the relationship between Labor and faith communities. And I think it took an outsider to pick up on this thread to really diagnose what's going on, that Labor has a problem with authority, and nowhere more so than when that authority is sacred authority. And I think it took a Brit to see that in us, that level of discomfort. The Labor's pretty good with hierarchical authority, parliamentary authority, even some kind of some things that hang from that. But what we're uncomfortable with, particularly in Australian Labor, is authority that sits outside what can be controlled. And that's really at odds with our history. I mean, with a union movement, with an appreciation for association, this is, a break in our history. And so it took Adrian to pick up on that. I think it's never been more important for the party to confront that, though, with this wonderful, so long awaited commitment to the voice to Parliament. It's going to challenge the party's thinking about authority and the Australian publics as well. And the more that the party can do to fill in that story and make it an expansive, confident story about the party wanting to devolve power to communities, the better. And so it's so important for enshrining a voice to Parliament, and it's important for communities broadly, including faith communities, for Labor to be able to tell that story and ensure that everybody can see their place within it.
And just to add to that, I mean, certainly the experience here in Victoria, I do work with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is negotiating a treaty with the Victorian state government. Some of the steps that the Victorian Labor government have had to do meet with the aspirations and the demands of the democratically elected First Peoples Assembly, in which they've said, if we're going to negotiate treaty, then we need an independent umpire, but it has to be an Aboriginal independent umpire. It can't be someone from government, and to actually then devolve that power to the Aboriginal community is a huge thing. And there's another, I know we spent the last 20 minutes shit on the Labor Party, but so I also do want to point out, yes, there are examples where we can learn and actually give that authority to others. So there are great examples, and we need to build on that as well. Before we switch over to then actually one more question I have for you before we switch over to, does the church have a problem with politics? Is we've talked about how people make assumptions, the wrong assumptions about people of faith, but also is there the reverse problem where sometimes we just take these votes for granted, which what I call the demographer's assumption, where they just sort of, go, they're migrant and Catholic and in the Western suburbs, therefore they vote Labor. And that's, we'll just leave them there and that's great, whereas, well, yeah, sure, they might vote Labor now, but, maybe something's happened and now their attitudes have changed somewhat. Are we taking that sort of faith-based tradition group for granted in terms of who we think is within our base and not actually doing enough to actually sort of meet with them and find out exactly what are their hopes and dreams, what are their challenges, what are their, what are their interests, what are their values?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that, in the sense that we're not thinking through enough the trajectory or the journey that voters might go on. So Andrew West did a great job at analysing some of the demographics in just after the 2019 election and drawing out this story that, the greatest predictor that someone would vote Labor was how recently they'd come to Australia, and the greatest predictor of someone's faith is how recently they came to Australia. So just showing there's just such a close connection there. Yet what we saw in the 2022 election was just the significant swing towards the Teals, and in terms of demographics, that was often with immigrant families, two people earning quite good income, often with two children who went to independent schools where they had a tradition, cultural tradition tied to Buddhism or Hinduism. And so quite different, therefore, from the agnostic base of the Greens, which, demographically speaking, you could talk about. So we shouldn't make assumptions about, someone who is going to be a voter for Labor now continuing on with us. One of the things that was written about the swing to the independents was their ability to actually grapple with the hyper-local issues and the problems in a federal system of the two parties often deciding mutually that they're not going to touch those hard local issues. You can see how those two different trends could well come together in the future if there are independents willing to grapple with the hard local issues, representative in a more direct way of cultural and religious diversity. People who have shifted and feel like their aspirations are not being appreciated, then you could see that that doesn't bode well for Labor. So I think it's really important to start thinking through some kind of future planning scenarios of what that could look like, and how do we engage now in a meaningful way with people for who their religion is important to their culture. And Labor's in a great position to do that, taking multiculturalism seriously. We now need to take people's religion and their cultural connection seriously as well.
Here. Can we just back that up a bit? That analysis of Teal voters that I've not heard this before. This is fascinating to me. That their religious background was Hindu or Buddhism. What?
In some of the seats, and so I remember reading this in the Fin Review shortly after that. Some of the base of the independents were the kind of the parents with two children who had pretty good incomes, who had a cultural connection to Hinduism or Buddhism, and their children most likely went to independent fee-paying schools.
That's interesting. I mean, yes.
So not going to hold in Wentworth, but I take it, in some of the other seats that this was a surprising find.
Yeah, I mean,
I
yes.
found it surprising.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, independent schools, tick, got that. Double income, two kids, tick, got that. Migrant background, maybe second generation, I can understand that as well, tick. But then the Hindu or Buddhism one has thrown me. That's a surprise. Interesting. Have to dive into that a bit more. Okay, let's flip the switch and have a look at the other side. Does the church have a problem with politics, and what are the central problems that we see with this relationship?
So it was really through my experience of leading an Anglican women's foundation over 5 years and building up our public engagement work, for a new season in the way that the deaconesses, who are the founders of this organisation, had done in their own time in the 1890s and other times that caused me to look into some of this stuff. So, the deaconesses worked on factory floors. They helped newly arrived immigrants to Australia. They did some extraordinary things. And so as I said about looking at, well, what could we do and support, in this century, I was really struck by the way in which public engagement had shifted for the church. And then my personal experiences, like we spoke about at the beginning, of assumptions being made about, who I might have worked for in Canberra and those kinds of things, forced me to kind of reckon with this. And it was really in that process that I started to think about what's distinctive about the church or faith community's kind of religion problem in Australia. And so I think focusing first on some of the Christian denominations, that there is always an element in Australia of us having kind of a frontier religiosity, and we've had a problematic relationship with politics. But there is something that is specific to us. It goes deeper about kind of an underdeveloped sense of how we engage in public life. And so, for example, there's only a very scant tradition of public theology in the Christian faith in Australia. Part of that goes to structural reasons that, the statutes that set up universities in Australia meant that there were never university departments of divinity or theology. And so you've had the development of the theological colleges that train those that go into ministry, separated out from the public universities. And that's different from the UK or the US. And so those who think about the relationship between, church and state, faith in public life, don't have the institutional support that they have in other places around the world. And so that ecosystem kind of has a bit of a gap in it. There aren't people thinking, floating balloons on these things, supporting practical action. But, there's also been more recent developments. So I think with the, within particular denominations, there's been specific events or trends that have meant that a conception of how that denomination engages publicly has been kind of compressed. So to speak to my own denomination, Anglican Church, there's been a sense that what it entails to be Christian doesn't place a lot of value on engagement in public life or political life. So kind of with the ascendancy of, I guess, what you could describe as a new Calvinism, there's not as deep an appreciation for the role of, political participation, and there's been a disconnection between kind of how people use their gifts with how you might serve in the common good. So there's been a kind of neglect of what it means for us to define and contribute to the common good. And all in all, you could sum this up, I think, in terms of a moment where the church in many different denominations has reacted against some of the kind of political developments by taking on this kind of exilic mindset, taking on the role of a victim that's just simply not open to us, and vacating the space, choosing to be quite reactionary, failing to connect with political leaders and parties, and pulling up the drawbridge effectively in local communities, focusing on the church as pretty narrowly construed.
where does this come from? Why are they pulling up that drawbridge, do you think?
Well, there was a book written in the US context called The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher, which was really putting out this kind of exilic solution, really saying, it's time to build another ark and get into it. I think part of it is a reaction against what is perceived as a loss of ascendancy in public life. So there is there are all sorts of interesting demographic shifts on this, but in developed countries, Christians as a proportion of the population are reduced. The proportion is decreasing, and so there's a real fear that goes kind of to an existential fear that we're losing cultural ascendancy, and so that fear and kind of reactions against developments in things like identity politics, with the backdrop of quite thin public theology of how to make sense of that, has meant that there have been kind of thought leaders and religious leaders who have advocated for this kind of, save ourselves and commentate from the sidelines type of approach.
When thinking about the questions for this podcast, I recalled in year 12 for one of my VCE cats, or HSC for people outside Victoria, my issue in English, my issue response thing, whatever the hell it was on the role of church and state. And at the time, it's in 1992-93, Jeff Kennett is the Premier of Victoria. And he was just a wrecking ball through the public service and privatising everything under the sun, and teachers and nurses and coal workers all losing their jobs. And so the churches or faith-based organisations really kind of pushed back at that moment from a welfare state perspective, saying, what you're doing here, you're really having an impact on the community. And Kennett pushed back on them and said, well, I don't give a stuff. And you should just stick to preaching about your God and stay inside your temple. And I don't want to hear you guys piping up and, in the public domain and, speaking on behalf of whatever and criticising my government, basically. I think I got an A. It was an amazing piece of work.
It sounds it.
Oh, it was incredible. And just think about how the resources to write that in those days. I mean, didn't have the internet. I just couldn't Google it. I had to actually go read books and, do you think that the church or faith-based organisations have kind of been battered by politics in some way whenever they have sort of lowered the drawbridge, if we can continue with this metaphor? So when they have crossed over into the political sphere, that they've either not been listened to or the experiences haven't been that great, and they're like, what's the point? Why do we bother?
Well, there definitely are experiences like that, and real moments where it seems to be the disconnect is so great. When you can't hire a Christian teacher in a Christian school. I think there's those kinds of examples where the divide has become significant. I'm sure that many church leaders could point to those examples, but that's kind of just, that's a bit lazy, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
It's insufficient to stay in that position. That, there are so many great examples of how Christian communities have stepped up to these new challenges of engaging in a positive way, and explaining, what it means to have sacred authority and the distinctive and unique contribution of a faith community in public life. And so I think that's really the next step, is to learn from those examples, where there has to be quite pragmatic in, translating the value of social cohesion that a church community provides and provision of social services, and quantifying that for political leaders, or, bringing church leaders to Canberra, all exercises I've seen happen really well and had a privilege to take part in. That's really where the engagement needs to start going, to inviting political leaders into churches as, significant publicly oriented institutions. And we see that in town halls during election debates. But simply can't stop on the hurts. You've got to move past them.
If I was a political leader here to represent the people of Victoria or Australia or wherever it may be, and I was approached by someone of faith, a leader within the church or whatever faith tradition it is, and they were pitching to me on something that didn't really align with my party's values, regardless of whether they align with mine or not, doesn't really matter. It's the party's values. There are some times where I think that the leadership of the church are disconnected from their own flock, and they might be presenting an argument on a particular issue. Maybe let's give the example of, say, women's health and abortion. Maybe some legislation's coming up. There are instances where I would feel comfortable saying back to an archbishop or whoever, going, mate, I don't actually. You may think that's what you think, but I would proffer to you that your faith, your flock, don't agree with you, and you're just running an argument based on the hierarchy of your church as opposed to actually what your community want. Now he and it would be he has every right to say back to me, well, I'll be the one who will determine what my flock thinks or not. But then I'd put back to him and say, well, I just don't think you actually carry the weight of your community when you walk into this room to make that argument. Is there a disconnect, do you think, between the leadership of these faith-based organisations and their own constituency, which undermines the work that they're trying to do?
I love the question because I think this gets to the heart of perhaps some misunderstandings about authority, right? So there is something that's specific about church authority, which means that there may well be a disconnect between the shepherd and the flock on an issue like that. But that's kind of not relevant in some ways from the church leader's perspective, that they're trying to teach and do the formation work of those in their church, and it's their role to advocate in public life on that issue. The role of the politician is probably to ask the question that you've posed of does this church position on this issue represent, does it tell me something of what that flock thinks? And if not, then I need to understand my constituency, respectful of the church authority, but thinking through the people I represent and what their actual positions are. So I think it's the kind of cultural fluency that's needed is the ability to hold those two things at once, because I think from the church's perspective, if there isn't a sense of authority in the way that we've just been wrestling with, you end up getting, things like platform speakers where they put themselves forward as church leaders, but with actually no church accountability or responsibility, and that unfortunately can become a very, very dangerous way of operating. And so it's often sadly taken on by women because they're not welcomed into leadership positions in the church. But it's grappling with these nuances that's key, and being able to, as you've said, ask the question. And, it might be a bit of an uncomfortable conversation, but it's an important one for political leaders to have.
Do you think I masked my own projections of the disappointment I have in my own church leaders in that question? I don't know if I did a good job of that or not anyway. Can we talk about the Pentecostal church for one moment? Certainly, our previous Prime Minister was a member of that New Age Christian faith-based tradition. There's sort of there's been not a lot of reporting, but a bit of reporting on the relationship that existed there between the PM's office and the leadership within the Pentecostal church. And I'm really conscious of not trying to sound like a sort of a mainstream Catholic sort of bigot picking on the Pentecostal church and whatnot. But to me, it looks that the relationship between some of the Liberal Party and that faith tradition feels very, very transactional, and that concerns me. I think that all that we've talked about today, I think where we want to lead towards is that a relationship between faith-based organisations and politics needs to be transformational, not transactional. And I just worry,
absolutely,
and I just worry that when I look at that, it is very transactional. I know that people with stronger minds than mine would say, well, actually, the Pentecostal church is basically based on transactional religion. But anyway, leaving that to one side, what's your take on what you saw during that era of the Morrison government and what we saw from the Pentecostal churches?
I think people have done well in analysing some of these dynamics, but zooming right out, and some of the personalities, but zooming right out, I think the issue is the one that you've named there of it's not good for anyone to have a transactional relationship. And I think one of the trends that you can see here in Australia and in other places around the world is the commodification of a particular religious affiliation or a denomination as a whole for political purposes. And commodification looks like those types of transactional relationships, doing deals on things and positioning of each other, and sometimes co-opting a whole identity as well. And that, that's something that needs to be avoided. And as you've really powerfully pointed to, the alternative is for there to be a transformational relationship between the two. And I think some of the very negative experiences that we've had in Australia recently point to the significance of finding those sorts of transformational opportunities going into the future.
We are a solutions-oriented podcast. We don't just want to have a chat that goes for 45 minutes to get shit off the liver. So I want to talk about where do we go from here? What are some of the solutions that both parties can do to start to improve that relationship and actually make some proper inroads into, I think, look, from a purely Labor perspective, making our community a far better place to live, really.
I think the big thing that comes to mind, it sounds abstract, but it's actually incredibly practical, is about getting on with the work of defining the common good and how the party is going to contribute to that. So that connects with our conversations previously about being comfortable with different forms of authority, getting ready to bring meaning to devolving power to communities, and particularly with the commitment to a voice to Parliament. So actually grappling with what we mean by a politics of the common good, what it means to be a party for all Australians, because that will very importantly open up vistas of future terms of a Labor government. Now's the time to do it. I think Jonathan West and Tom Bentley have written really powerfully about the kind of waning value in the consensus created in earlier eras, that there's not much left to go, the engine's running dry. So if Labor wants to build out this distinctive way of doing a new form of politics, then it'd do really well in defining the common good. I think the second thing is to use some of these community organising methods that have been so well demonstrated to be a party of people and show what it looks like to bring together incredibly diverse actors, including people with a diverse faith. If we want to have a reconciled nation with, and a country that embraces its diversity, then we need to find those practical ways of doing it, helping people to be comfortable with difference, present, and to focus on kind of imaginative future ways of doing things. I think so that would be the second, is demonstrating it through community organising. And the third would be for church and other faith leaders to pick up on these signals and to start investing in public engagement by their own communities. So showing that their church, for example, their synagogue, their mosque is part of a social infrastructure in community, and to do the translation work sometimes that's needed with a kind of position of, or a kind of humble approach to bring it within the frame of relevance to government. So whether that's making visible the number of hours that are provided by volunteers within churches in a particular denomination or whatever that is, but starting to speak the language of those in political life, I think could go a long way to bridging what's been a divide.
Here. Kate, Brennan, I am so glad we had this conversation. And there's a whole heap of other questions I do want to ask you, but we're going to have to leave it there because I know you've got to run to a meeting and this could go on forever. But first of all, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'm glad we got to do this eventually. Please come back on again in the future, and good luck with your role at Sydney Uni. Is anything you want to plug, or if anyone wants to reach out to you, how's the best way to get you on social media? What's the best way for people to contact you?
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen. We're on Twitter at the Sydney Policy Lab, and love to hear your thoughts on the way that we can connect with diverse community. So reach us there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate. Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on.